Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and I'm a huge fan of playing playstyles in WoW that are a little bit of an underdog. There's usually something cool that you can find when you play builds that just haven't been explored. It's almost like being an explorer, discovering things for the first time, and being the first one to figure out how it works is super fun. Shadowlands is full of them when it comes to different specs, different playstyles, and different covenant choices. Not everything is going to be the next best thing. There are a lot of weird combinations that actually work in very specific environments and can be a ton of fun if played correctly. Before 9.1, I discovered Kyrian Arcane, I looked up guides on how to play properly, and now everybody in 9.1 plays Kyrian Arcane, an obscure playstyle that wasn't popular at the time and then became one, and I got to experience it before everybody else started playing. So even if there's something that isn't popular now, it could at some point become really good in the future, and that's just how scaling in World of Warcraft classes work. However, there are some playstyles in 9.1 in particular that are still very much an underdog that I want desperately for Blizzard to potentially look at and buff, because there could be a lot of fun in these playstyles if they were good one day. But also, are you one of those people that watches YouTube videos that isn't subscribed? Quite a lot of you guys actually watch my videos but won't hit subscribe button. Might as well hit subscribe, hit the bell, it helps out the channel. You watch these videos anyway. Let's dive into the 9.1.5 Covenant stuff. The first covenant on this list will be for Warlocks. The most popular covenant for Warlocks for any playstyle is Night Fate, with a bunch of blue dots that has a bunch of different benefits depending on the soul bind that you run. The ability is very flexible, but it works for all kinds of content, plus soul shape is amazing for a class as slow as a lock. Necrolord isn't super popular for every single spec, but Demonology combined with Necrolord inside of PvP makes for some really cheesy one-shots. Kyrian is a little obscure, but it adds a permadot, so if you always want to play a playstyle with a constant damage and ability that's always there on the target, it does act towards all three playstyles for Warlocks, plus if the target dies with the dot, you do get at least some sort of a benefit from it. And then we have the Venthyr playstyle, which is what I really wanted to spotlight. Particularly the guide right here that reads that Venthyr playstyle and just picking that covenant is actually a DPS minus if you have any other abilities that have filler AoE. So this guide might have ripped into this ability really hard, maybe a tad outdated, but still it shows Venthyr is just kind of poor. So while it maybe not as a complete DPS minus, it's just not optimal, not good, not really practical either. The ability has an amazing visual, but also the playstyle creeds towards playing into the curse mechanic. Curses being just debuffs that Warlocks can put around, mostly used for PvP, somewhat for PvE. You fire off this visceral blood bolt and it curses every enemy that it touches at the very end of the explosion, putting a damage over time ability on every single target. Unless in very specific situations where you're hitting some ludicrous amount of enemies stacked together in an uncapped AoE, essentially it's just a worse version of the Knight's Fake Covenant ability with a longer cast time, less damage, and more of a mana cost. Where Venthyr Covenant has been pretty good for some of the other casters, particularly Venthyr Boomkins, but mages have also gotten benefits from it before, as well as Shadow Priest. For a class as immobile as a Warlock, being able to teleport to a location you would imagine would be pretty fantastic, but the benefits of going Venthyr are very low compared to disadvantages compared to other Covenants. In order to fix it, I think Blizzard really would need to tackle the actual ability of the Venthyr Warlock. It's just not a super popular, not a fun ability to press since there's so many better alternatives. And I actually came up with some of the different ideas. I feel like there's cool mechanics that could be explored in the future, but this ability does need improvement. Because this ability does actually come with some utilitarian aspects that are just kind of weak, that is curses. The fact that it applies curses to the melee, to the casters, is pretty interesting because it does debuff enemies to make things easy for your tank, for example. You already have a utilitarian concept that plays on curses, which is a unique mechanic to this ability that none of the others do. But what if they took it a step further to make it more interesting? Not talking about the damage yet for this ability, let's just talk about potential utilitarian things it did. And I came up with an idea of what if, instead of applying just one curse, it applied all three of them, no matter the enemy. Apply Curse of Weakness so enemies auto-attack slower, Curse of Tongue so the cast a little slower, but also Curse of Exhaustion for a slow. Imagine how useful that would be in the Mythic Plus scenario, or even potentially in PvP. Or, better yet, what if these curses not only applied three of them, but empowered version of these curses? You see, some of the class abilities do have ways to debuff your enemy, like the Venthyr Demon Hunter with the Mark ability that marks the enemy to take a lot of damage over time, but also debuffs the enemy so they hit slower and cast slower. It's not a strong effect, but it can be useful and it can save your tanks from imminent death. So what if the Warlocks leaned in on a debuff element with this ability, where you got an empowered Curse of Weakness, so enemies are really slow on autos, really slow on casts, but also really slow when chasing after the tank. This alone would give this ability to utilitarian uses, which I think would not only interesting, but also very handy. Another concept would be just to buff the ability damage, and honestly, they could probably do the first idea that I had, but also the second, because the damage is kind of low. You can technically run the conduit as well as a legendary in order to buff the damage of this ability, but warlocks have way better legendaries, one, but also generally warlocks have better conduits as well. And if you are playing Vent there, you might as well play another Covenant, because then you could even gain more value. So this ability just falls apart even just on damage alone. Third idea would make this ability more interesting. The other Covenants have soul binds, or the ability itself augments the way your character plays and even gives you different decisions to make, which talents you run, or which playstyles you want to go for, which trinkets you want to run, and how to adjust your playstyle in general. I feel like if they were to maybe add like a debuff mechanic to Impending Catastrophe, where once it hits the target, it does the curse stuff, it does the damage, but also maybe puts a debuff on the enemy where they take, let's say, for Affliction more dot damage, for Destro more fire damage, and for Demonology more pet damage, which would at least allow Warlocks to play around that minute cooldown, which would fairly synergize with a lot of the other CDs that Warlocks have, except Demonology, but there's even a legendary that can run in order to solve that issue. And at least it would be somewhat interesting. It would be probably the laziest way of just like, oh, debuff, and now your basic mechanics do more. Because the Vent your soul binds don't really augment the playstyle of Warlock in any fun ways. You can make it so Impending Catastrophe does add you versatility, but comparing versatility to mastery that Night Fae grants, which is unique to every single spec that bolsters some kind of a playstyle that you do, it feels like that this ability just finds itself lacking and could be more interesting. Another playstyle that I would love to see work out really well, and while it's not completely dead in the water, but the Necrolord mage. Now, it does have some unique playstyles to it, but it's a pretty, I don't know what's the best word for it, not an optimal ability depending on your spec, just because of its raw design. So how could we modify that design even further? Because the mage ability looks sick. I mean, when you transform into Mages of the Dead, you look amazing. You look awesome. It's like a metamorphosis. You look like a necromancer. How can you tell me that this ability, with how good it looks, just doesn't perform nearly as well, or even somewhat well to begin with? And honestly, I feel like that's a big shame for the ability. It looks great, but it doesn't perform great. And what if it did? When it transforms into a Necrolord mage, you get a little bit extra damage for all your spells, but also it augments your filler abilities to also cleave necessary secondary targets. This works out, but not always, depending on your playstyle, depending on the spec, and the way that all three mage specs are designed. The filler abilities all have different uses, which already puts its credence to why this ability falls short almost always. The filler abilities and their importance in the rotation for fire, frost, as well as arcane are all different, but also the fact that this ability is a 3-minute cooldown, which doesn't really line up with a lot of the other mage abilities either. Let's start with the filler abilities, and for arcane, it's already an impressive one, because majority of the damage is going to come from arcane blasts. Your ability of arcane blast is going to buff up the damage that you do with your arcane charges, and it's going to be your primary damage source out of all the other filler abilities. With a 3-minute cooldown, it generally can sort of kind of line up with your arcane power. With a conduit, you can more or less make it kind of sort of close to one another, but not really. So at least it's in a better position, but mostly because of the strength of its primary ability, Arcane Blast, it can actually get some benefit in cleave situations. Fire, probably one of the worst scenarios where you are fireballing as a filler, nothing more. It is not going to be your hardest hitting ability. Especially during your burst, you're not even going to press fireball, so you have a legendary that works off of your fireballs, and even if you run the legendary, you won't be able to get the value because that's not even an ability that you're prioritizing the playstyle. It is a filler ability where there's no other abilities to use, unlike Arcane where it's one of your best abilities to use. For fire, the biggest, easiest fix I imagine would be to incorporate more abilities into this cleave playstyle, like Pyroblast. Off the bat, you can imagine just how much damage it would do if you went full Necrolord in a Mythic Plus with 3 targets that are all going to take a lot of damage and gonna live for a while you're combusting, pyroblasting all 3 of them, generating a ton of hot streak procs where you can essentially fire off pyroblasts over and over and over. Already, that sounds busted. But I think if they were to play into the playstyle where they want to incorporate filler abilities, then hitting the ones that you are going to be using the most, especially during your big burst, will probably be the best choice. For Frost, you have a very similar situation as Fire, although Frostbolt is an integral part of the Frost Mage playstyle, it's just not your hardest hitting ability. For Frost Mages, you want to hit Frostbolts in order to get procs, so then your hardest hitting abilities and combos can be used, and they will all be instacast, and they'll have a higher chance to crit, and also will do a ton more damage. But like Fire, whenever during your big cooldowns, if you are swimming in procs, you're not really going to end up pressing Frostbolt that much. Instead, you're actually going to press those Ice Lances, those Flurries, in order to get the biggest value out of them. And then you're also running into a very similar Fire Mage situation. With Frost Mage, it's a little bit harder, unlike with Fire. If you were to, let's say, make it so the Pyroblast can cleave other targets, with Frost Mage, you can't really make Ice Lances cleave other targets. I mean, you could, but there's already talent that kind of does this. I guess you could also do it with Flurries, but also Flurry is kind of like a proc ability that primes your next ability to be a hard hitter, and if Flurry is just debuffing a secondary target that you're not focusing on and isn't getting cleaved by your lances, then it also becomes kind of useless. So the biggest problem, in my opinion, is the Necrolord ability and how it interacts with specs, as it just has a blanket, your filler ability cleaves other targets. And that's a problem because it doesn't work well for every single spec, because their fillers are completely different. So for Arcane Mages, that augments their strongest ability that they're going to use quite often, and it gives a cleave capability, which is something to use in single target, but now can also kind of use it in AoE, which makes it super strong. For Fire Mages, it should probably augment something that's not a Fireball, something that actually is part of your damage rotation, something that also would synergize during your combustion, so it would fit a lot better into the playstyle. Things like Pyroblast make sense, but also Fire Blast I think could work, or maybe even buffing the damage of your Phoenix Flames. Or what if it just gave you more mastery while you kept it up without augmenting your Fireball, but also just giving you more of stats, just some kind of a passive that alters the way that your character plays. But if you are given some kind of passive buffs while you have this ability active, there's a lot more playability with things like Frost Mage, where maybe you could give you more Ice Lances, which can also cleave if you're playing the right talents, which can be good on single target, but also can be kind of good on AoE, or maybe it modifies your Ice Lance so it hits harder, or it sends 2 Ice Lances instead of 1, which lets you double dip onto potentially the Frost Mage Shatter playstyle. And while I understand that that sounds broken, I'm not suggesting that they exactly implement that, but what I'm saying is they need to rethink about what abilities you should augment, because each spec is different, its requirements are different, what it's looking for, its goals are different, and they should probably augment what the Necrolord ability buffs and how it impacts the spec depending on the unique playstyles and different tasks and different goals that all these specs try to accomplish. Finally, we have Death Knight that isn't Necrolord. So while in this one we don't really have one covenant to talk about, we have a couple. So for DKs, it's going to be basically any covenant that isn't the Necrolord covenant. What I noticed with Death Knights after playing mine for quite a while, and I love my Death Knight, I still am hoping the two-hand playstyle at some point will be actually good for PvE, but maybe at some point Blizzard will buff it, or just maybe with gear we'll be able to catch up with scaling. Either way, from my time playing different covenants of Death Knight, I noticed that Necrolord is really strong, but the other ones, while they technically are not terrible, they are outshined pretty hard. Carrion provides you quite a bit of mastery, which can work out with Frost Mages pretty well. It also gives you quite a bit of defensiveness with the Sippy Cup for the Blood Death Knight, but I'm a DPS character main for the most part, so we're not really talking about tanks. The ability itself, though, is supposed to be able to jump to secondary targets at 100% rate in 9.1.5, but it's still really broken and doesn't function with Unholy for one reason or another. If you drop down Death and Decay, you send out the Shackle, trying to go for your Cleave, it just doesn't jump to secondary targets, making it pretty useless. And even if you can get a mastery buff from Pelagos Soulbind, it still feels like a broken ability that just doesn't work. Venthyr as an ability is also pretty cool. It gives you a Swarm and Miss that gives you a bit of dodge, can be useful as a tank, but from a DPS perspective, it's a lot of runic power. As a Frost DK, you can use it in order to give yourself pretty big breath windows. I really wish Frost DK had some kind of runic AoE spender that isn't just breath or anything that isn't need to be talented, just some baseline. It would feel nice. But for Unholy, it's also big epidemics, and if you use it at the right time, that could be a lot of AoE damage that you could kind of chain, and in AoE scenarios by itself, it's not really that bad. It's an ability that gives you a lot of resources, and you still have to figure out how to use those resources, so it is decent, but it's a little more hands-on, and you do have need to have a little bit of timing to it. Night Fade drops down a blue Death and Decay that allows your cleave abilities, and Frost DK can also cleave with Obliterate with it now, where it will sap the strength from your enemies and give that strength to you. It takes a little bit of setup because you do have to drop the ability down, get a bunch of cleave. If you're playing Unholy, that's quite a lot of runic power spenders. If you're playing Frost, also you need to make sure that you have a little bit of runic power. On single target, it does become a little bit challenging unless you pre-plan for it, but it's an ability where you have to go out of your way to get ahead of your resources in order to make sure you're getting big value for it. And then there's Necrolord, where you turn the ability on, it gives you free resources, it slaps every enemy in line of sight, and it grips them to you. It is super simple. Blizzard has been buffing the other covenants, everything that is on Necrolord, in terms of the conduits and adjusting their abilities ever so slightly. And so far the changes they've done are pretty good, and technically none of the other covenants are bad. In fact, most of them are actually decent, and technically Death Knights can play anything. It's just Necrolord ability is just so brain dead easy, and is the best choice on its option. It's also the most versatile in its role as well. It just is really difficult to try something else and find ways to justify it because it's just so damn good. For Death Knights, I don't really know what the best option, and the laziest one is to be just to buff the abilities that is a Necrolord, because they already have a little bit of slight complexities and unique playstyles designed for them from the bottom up. It's just they're not as effective, and they're a little bit more complex, or a little bit more involved rather, not really complex to play, but if that complexity, that involvement, you're not really rewarded for it, which is I guess my biggest gripe with it. Sorry, kind of a long video, but I really wanted to dive into some of the different covenants that I think Blizzard could amp up in order to make him better, make him more playable, but also make him overall interesting. I want all the different playstyles to be good, and I think they've done a pretty decent job of trying to make things kind of sort of viable, kind of sort of playable, even if there's just a handful of situations where they can be extremely good. There's some that are just overshadowed pretty hard, and I would like for them to become something unique, something interesting down the line. But anyway, thank you guys so much for checking out this video. Let me know your thoughts about the covenants that I talked about in this video. Do you think there's any other covenants that could improve in the future? Let me know that in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see all of you in the next video.